You've no doubt heard that the Amazon rainforest is the lungs of the Earth, and by now we've all seen the memes. Whenever someone proposes a new way to remove carbon from the atmosphere, the reaction is often, sure, or we could plant more trees. But have you ever wondered how effective this could actually be, realistically? Have you speculated how many trees would be needed, or where they might be planted? Could the solution to climate change really be as simple as plant more trees? Hi, I'm Dr. Eleanor Tufnell, an environmental scientist, and today we're going to be exploring the exciting world of geoengineering and puzzling out whether we can really save the planet by planting trees. What is geoengineering? Geoengineering has a number of names. Popular ones include climate intervention and climate engineering. This refers to the deliberate, large-scale manipulation of the Earth's climate with the intention of achieving specific benefits, usually the mitigation or counteraction of human-caused climate change. This is generally divided into two rather broad categories: solar radiation modification, SRM, and carbon dioxide removal, CDR. Naturally, today's video focuses on carbon dioxide removal, and there are many ways that this can be achieved, such as sequestering carbon in soil through specialised agricultural practices, direct air capture, ocean fertilisation, ocean alkalinity enhancement, and wetland restoration, all of which deserve their own videos. I'm working on it, but if there's something in particular you would want to see soon, do let me know in the comments. But today I will be focusing on afforestation and reforestation. How does it work? Well, through the magic of photosynthesis. Energy from the sunlight is used to convert CO2 and water into O2 and carbohydrates, using a process called carbon fixation. These carbohydrates are then distributed and stored throughout the plant. When evaluating how much carbon a forest can store, we don't just consider how much carbon is locked up in individual trees. We consider the ecosystem as a whole. This means not just the standing trees, but the other plants in the forest, from shrubs to ferns to ground cover, the dead material from the forest, such as fallen leaves and branches, and of course, the soil. When trees shed their leaves, some of the carbon stored in them is released as it decays, but plenty of it remains stored in the soil, and this can build over time. The same can be said for fallen trees, as much of that woody material will remain in the soil. Carbon that is in a living tree or locked up in the soil beneath a forest has been removed, at least for now, from the atmosphere. So the logic of planting trees to capture carbon is clear. The more trees, the more carbon we capture. Factors to take into account. Unfortunately, it's not quite that simple. These things never are. There are a large number of factors that affect how much and how fast carbon can be sequestered by a forest. Firstly, there is the age and maturity of the trees. Once trees are established and start to grow, the uptake of CO2, thanks to photosynthesis, begins to increase. And as such, the stock of carbon stored in the forest increases. The rate at which carbon is stored begins to exceed the rate of carbon lost through decomposition and the respiration of the trees and soil. This increase in the rate of carbon uptake continues until the trees have reached maturity, where their growth rate slows. How much the carbon is transferred to the soil varies and can be affected by previous land use, how long the soil has been established under a forest, and the soil type. For example, clay soils, due to their stable structure and the high content of organic matter, have excellent potential to store carbon. Conversely, sandy soils, with their high mineral content but low organic matter content, have a much lower potential for carbon storage. However, forests cannot remove and store CO2 from the atmosphere indefinitely. Once the forest grows old enough, equilibrium is reached, meaning that the CO2 removed via photosynthesis is balanced by the CO2 being returned to the atmosphere through decomposition and respiration processes. This balance remains unless disrupted, either by natural events such as storms, fire or drought, or by human intervention such as the harvesting of the forest. It should also be noted that the ways the area is initially prepared for forestation can cause significant loss of carbon from soils, and this can take time to recover. Another factor is the species of trees planted. Fast-growing productive conifers tend to sequester the most carbon over shorter time frames, up to 50 years. On the other hand, over longer periods of time, long-lived broad-leafed species sequester large stocks of carbon, both above and below ground. How forests are set up for CO2 sequestering. How woodland is managed will impact how effective it is at CO2 sequestering. This is particularly the case during the initial preparation and planting, as the better the tree's survival rate and the faster they become established, the sooner and faster they can sequester CO2. As mentioned before, the initial prep for forestation can result in loss of CO2 from soils, and this is one of the reasons that not all sites are appropriate for forestation. If the area already has high soil carbon, then the loss during the establishment phase may not be offset quickly or at all by the planting of trees. Though potentially slower than establishment, native colonisation of an area, slowly transforming it into a forest, can be an option for some areas and avoids many of the downsides of manually preparing the ground for trees. Sites with high biodiversity, such as wildflower meadows and grassland, might be better off being preserved as they are rather than converting them to woodland. Woodland provides different habitat, and it is best not to sacrifice one valuable habitat for another. It would also be counterproductive to use agricultural land for tree planting and then replace that agricultural land by felling existing trees elsewhere. As the climate is changing, when selecting trees to plant, it is important to consider not just current conditions, but the conditions the trees are likely to experience decades from now. Other considerations include which trees will thrive in the location's soil type, how the forest will be utilised or managed, and what the local climate is. For example, there is concern that afforestation in the Arctic tundra would result in a reduced surface albedo, how much solar radiation is reflected, which could result in a net warming and thus be counterproductive for climate mitigation purposes. When estimating how much carbon will be sequestered, it's also important to include the time needed for trees to grow, factor in greenhouse gas emissions from the initial establishment of the woodland, take into account the forest ecosystem as a whole rather than focusing just on number of trees planted, and account for tree losses from human or natural disturbances. How to store CO2 long term. Carbon will not be locked in a tree forever. The tree will eventually die, and this may result in a release of carbon. So how do we minimise this and maximise carbon sequestering? One word: biochar. Forest management often generates low-value, woody biomass, for example by cutting branches that have become damaged or diseased, or to reduce fire risk. Managed woodland may also utilise coppicing and pollarding, either for commercial use or to maintain forest health. One use for the resulting wood is biochar. This is what you get when you heat organic material, in this case wood, in an anaerobic environment, sans oxygen, and this produces charcoal. The intense heat can prevent the carbon from degrading and returning to the air. This biochar can then be added to soil, which helps sequester the carbon long term. Adding biochar to the soil has a lot of other advantages. It can improve soil fertility, improve water retention and release, and stabilise heavy metals and other pollutants. However, the effect we are most interested in here is carbon sequestering. Soil has a higher capacity to store CO2 than the atmosphere, roughly 2 to 3 times higher, in fact. Soil's capacity to store CO2 is 3 to 4 times greater than vegetation. CO2 is also 50 times more concentrated in soil than it is in the air, though it should be noted that the composition of biochar will vary depending on the source material, how it is processed, local soil and the local climate. This means that how long carbon locked in biochar remains sequestered will also vary somewhat. An alternative solution to long-term carbon storage was proposed in a recent paper, which suggests sinking timber cut from boreal forests into the Arctic Ocean. If the wood is sunk into deep, very cold, low oxygen waters, it would not decompose and would instead act as a long-term storage for that carbon. The paper predicts this could absorb 1 billion tonnes of carbon annually. However, this is a somewhat controversial proposal, as there are a number of concerns regarding things such as the effect of clearing existing forests, which currently store carbon, land disruption from the harvest and replanting, and the impact on rivers of floating this much timber down them, and whether the sites where the wood is sunk would remain suitable long term. After all, the world is warming, so areas that could store wood now may not be able to do so in a few decades' time. How much CO2 can we remove via planting trees? So we've established that planting trees can sequester carbon, but how much, and is it enough? Quick terminology briefing. A CO2 equivalent is a unit of measurement used to compare emissions from different greenhouse gases and is based on their global warming potential. At present, the Earth's forests and soils absorb approximately 30% of atmospheric carbon emissions. In terms of new forests, the UK has been working on planting 30,000 hectares of new woodland every year from 2024, aiming for a coverage of trees and woodland of 16.5% by 2050, which would be 800,000 hectares. In combination with improved management of existing woodlands, this is estimated to save 12 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent by 2050, and an additional 14 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent per year would be retained due to harvested materials. That's a significant amount of carbon locked up, but how much is it compared to the current UK CO2 emissions? Well, it's around 6%. Exact estimates on how much carbon could realistically be removed by tree planting alone are difficult to make. As discussed previously, there are a lot of factors at play. A very optimistic estimate is that the Earth could support 25% more forested areas than it presently has. This would require planting 500 billion trees and potentially capture more than 200 gigatons of carbon, reducing atmospheric carbon by 25%. To put that into perspective, that would be about half of all the carbon emitted by humans since 1960. This study did garner some critique and concerns, which ranged from the feasibility of such a large-scale endeavour to concerns that biodiversity would be lost by replacing existing biomes such as grassland with forest. There are also concerns regarding whether the numbers reported are an overestimate. However, if we assume for now that this is an upper estimate for the potential of reforestation to sequester carbon and accept limitations such as preserving other habitats, then we are left with a few conclusions. Forestation is effective at sequestering carbon, however, it takes time, there are limited places where it is appropriate, and even if done to its maximum potential, it cannot fully mitigate human-caused climate change. Forestation is an important tool for climate mitigation, but is not alone sufficient. However, when combined with broad efforts to reduce emissions to net zero and potentially other carbon capture or solar radiation mitigation measures, planting trees really can help save the planet. Other benefits. Of course, planting trees has many more beneficial effects than carbon capture. Doing so can support wildlife, promote nature recovery and biodiversity, provide shelter for livestock, mitigate flooding and soil erosion, provide space for leisure activities such as walking and cycling, produce food and timber, improve air quality, and support human mental health and well-being. Woodlands come in a massive number of different types, differing by location, soil type and hydrology. The Woodland Trust describes 18 different UK woodland types in its Tree Species Handbook, and this includes acidic upland, base-rich upland, and wet lowland. Each woodland type has its own distinct ranges of trees, shrubs, and undergrowth, and wildlife species. Decline in biodiversity is a problem worldwide, and here in the UK, a recent study found that 1 in 6 of the 10,000 species assessed were at risk of being lost. Planting and maintaining woodland provides refuge for native flora and fauna, many of which require specific habitat to survive. Conclusion. I realise this was quite a lot of information about tree planting and climate mitigation, so I'll do my best to sum up here. Forestation can have substantial impact on atmospheric carbon, but it cannot achieve sufficient climate mitigation alone. Combined with reduced emissions and other geoengineering techniques, however, planting trees is an important and effective option for carbon sequestering. It additionally provides many benefits both to humans and to wildlife. I really hope you've enjoyed this video and that you found it informative. As always, I will be leaving a library of links in the description for you if you want to learn more. If you did enjoy this video, it really helps me out if you subscribe, comment, like, and share it with anyone you think will find it useful. So till next time, thank you for watching.